Despite its growth in becoming a mainstream business function, those operating within procurement have a number of constraints and challenges to negotiate. From the perspective of the professional buyer, just because you might have a hand on the company's purse strings doesn't mean to say you can spend the money in any way you see fit. So here are 10 challenges faced by professional buyers and procurement leaders. Challenge number 1, status anxiety. In the first video, we noted that more and more companies were appointing chief procurement officers to high office, and some had even become CEOs. Whilst these are demonstrations of the growth of procurement influence, there remains a large minority who still feel the strategic worth of procurement is undervalued. And this can mean that procurement professionals can be sensitive to internal stakeholders having close relationships with key suppliers, particularly those that leave out procurement representation during their discussions. So it's always worthwhile for the salesperson to consider whether procurement is being isolated and whether that is ultimately going to help or hinder the sale. Challenge number 2, challenging stakeholder relationships. Everyone considers themselves a buyer. We all do it in our domestic lives. We all negotiate, and so internal stakeholders routinely underestimate the complexity and sophistication of the professional buyer role and instead experience procurement procedures as bureaucratic and slow. They just want to get on with their jobs with a minimum of fuss. But this creates tension between the procurement function and the rest of the organization. Sellers should be aware of these tensions, particularly when it may be impacting contract decision making at the customer. Challenge number 3 is about measuring value. We'll discuss how procurement performance is measured later in this series, but for now the important point to note is that although procurement is primarily measured on cost savings, usually price, most professionals do appreciate the supplier's broader value offering. They understand total cost of ownership, or TCO, but they rarely get credit for delivering it. They know that the lowest price doesn't necessarily mean lowest cost or best value, but the problem they have is chief financial officers still measure procurement on savings. And that's not to say that CFOs themselves don't understand value. It's mainly because it's extraordinarily difficult to measure. Measuring savings is easy, value far harder. So the default is to measure cost savings. This makes selling value to procurement a real challenge for sales. Challenge number 4, the savings cul-de-sac. Generating savings from the supply chain is a game of diminishing returns. If procurement only focuses on price savings, as mentioned, its primary performance indicator, then savings will eventually dry up and TCO might even rise. Rather than broadening the task to include a much wider range of value levers, many procurement leaders are trapped in an increasingly difficult chase for savings. It's one of the reasons why CPOs frequently move company during their careers. A fresh start elsewhere usually involves a honeymoon period where savings are to some degree sidelined in favour of reorganisation or transformation. For sales, it means acknowledging that savings are always going to be important, but sometimes more or less important depending on the circumstances. Challenge number 5, restrictions in procurement scope. Despite procurement leading the formal sourcing process, some categories are off limits. And this obviously depends on the organisation, but service categories in particular are often overseen and/or commissioned by senior leaders in other functions. And these include consulting, legal services, audit, and information technology. This can be a source of frustration for procurement as savings and value improvements are not as diligently pursued by senior stakeholders as they would be by the professional buyers. Nevertheless, procurement's reach into these categories is improving, and sales must be careful not to make the mistake of assuming procurement is completely isolated from the buying decision.